It is now my honor and privilege to introduce our featured speaker, Attorney Stephen B. Bright, Harvey L. Karp, visiting lecturer in law at Yale Law School, and former director of the Southern Center for Human Rights. Attorney Bright received his BA and JD from the University of Kentucky. He is the co-author with his former student and UConn Law's own Professor Emeritus James Kwok of the 2023 book titled The Fear of Too Much Justice: Race, Poverty, and the Persistence of Inequality in the Criminal Courts. Attorney Bright's commitment to justice and the rule of law is matched only by his accomplishments. He has tried capital cases in Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi, and argued cases before state and federal appellate courts. He has won reversals from the United States Supreme Court in 4 capital cases, an impressive record that is chronicled in a new book, Demand the Impossible: One Lawyer's Pursuit of Equal Justice for All, by law professor Robert Sy. Throughout his work as a legal services attorney in Appalachia, a public defender in Washington, D.C., and a leading human rights advocate, Attorney Bright has devoted himself to helping those whose freedom and lives are threatened by the flaws in our society and justice system. He sees the humanity in his clients and others and encourages us to do the same. It is truly an honor to have him with us today. Please join me in welcoming Attorney Stephen Bright.
Thank you so much, Dean Nelson. I am so grateful to Dean Nelson, to the faculty here, and others for the invitation to be here today, and honored and grateful to be able to congratulate you on what you have accomplished and make a few remarks about the challenges and opportunities that are ahead. I want to congratulate those who are graduating, as well as your parents, your partners, your siblings, your families, your teachers, your friends, everybody who has touched your life in the journey that brought you here to today. Congratulations on this special day. You graduates know that you didn't get here by yourself. You depended on your families and your friends, and going forward, you're going to depend on families and friends and assistants and people you will encounter in the legal profession and many others going forward. My advice is appreciate them, respect them, treat them well, and never miss the opportunity to let them know how much you depend upon them as you go forward in your careers. I know you've had a great legal education here because I know many of your professors. As Dean Nelson said, James Kwok is not only a friend, is a former student of mine, and for 10 years was on the faculty here. As Dean Nelson said, he and I put out a book this last year, and I will tell you, just between us, that book would not have been published if it hadn't been for James Kwok. So I'm very grateful. And Bethany, who's sitting right over here, was in my class at Yale, and I won't talk about everybody else that I know here. But I want to just say this quickly. Being at this state's flagship law school today reminds me of my own graduation 50 years ago at the flagship law school in my home state, the University of Kentucky. Back at that time, a half century ago, the University of Kentucky had a fairly good basketball team. It won several NCAA championships, but I understand that the place for championship basketball today is the University of Connecticut. Am I right about that? The men won it all, and the women were in the Final Four for the 23rd time. How remarkable. And a week ago today, one of the greatest UConn players, and one of the greatest players, period, Maya Moore Irons, received an honorary degree and spoke at the commencement of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences of this university. As you know, She led UConn to 2 back-to-back undefeated seasons as well as championships, then went on to lead her WNBA team to 4 championships, and also picked up a couple of gold medals at the Olympics. She shocked everyone when at the very peak of her career, she stepped away from her basketball to deal with the legal system and get a man out of prison. She worked for the release of Jonathan Irons, who had been convicted at age 16 of burglary and assault by an all-white jury in Missouri and sentenced to 65 years in an adult prison. She had met him before her first year at UConn as a result of becoming aware of his case through her family's involvement in a prison ministry. Her efforts helped show that he was in fact innocent and that his and as a result, his convictions were set aside and he was released in 2020 after 23 and a half years in prison for a crime he did not do. Later that year, they got married. Now they have a son. They've written a book called Love and Justice. And they have a campaign, a social action campaign called Win with Justice, aimed at educating people about the power of prosecutors. Little did you know you might meet the great love of your life at a maximum security prison. Unfortunately, the case of Jonathan Irons is not an isolated case. Nicholas Davidoff describes the case of another innocent 16-year-old who was convicted and sentenced to an adult prison here in Connecticut, just down the road in New Haven. He wrote a book called The Other Side of Prospect. It's a marvelous book about how innocent people get convicted, but also about the persistence of a dedicated lawyer to get that person out of prison, and also the responsibility that prosecutors took to get an innocent man out of prison. And a lot of that, and a key part of that happened right here at this law school at a meeting where the prosecutors talked about wrongful convictions and how people were wrongfully convicted and looked into this case. As James and I say in our book, the fact that the legal system is failing to get it right on the most basic question between guilt or innocence is a matter for a great deal of concern. But we also point out that there is a question, too, of proportion, a question of excessive punishment for those who are, in fact, guilty. This last Tuesday, a dear friend of mine, Tony Amadeo, passed away. 40 years ago, we were trying to keep the state of Georgia from executing him. When the state and federal courts turned us down, despite the fact that we could show that the prosecutor had told the jury commissioners to underrepresent black people in the jury pools, we threw what was just a Hail Mary pass at the Supreme Court of the United States. And lo and behold, they took the case. I didn't really know at that time in my career whether we were ready to argue a case at the Supreme Court, but we went there and we argued the facts and we won the case. And we were successful in avoiding the death penalty on remand. Tony spent 38 years in prison. He was a model prisoner. He was an accomplished carpenter and cabinet maker. He took classes and graduated from honors with Mercer University, and he provided hospice care to fellow prisoners. After his release in 2015, he became the operations manager for a ranch in Texas, and he worked there until he passed away this last week. When he was 18 years old, the state of Georgia, the legal machinery of the state of Georgia, decided that he was so beyond redemption, he should be eliminated from the human community. I saw him graduate summa cum laude from Mercer University. I went to the ranch and visited with him and saw how he was handling things there. And I'll never forget a speech he gave not long after he got out in Washington, D.C., where he remarked upon the irony of just 2 months before sitting on a metal bench in a prison and now being in Washington, the nation's capital, on a program with Senator Cory Booker and other distinguished people, as he talked about how his life had changed. He had a lot to give. We spent a lot of money, the state spent a lot of money keeping them locked up a lot longer than needed to be the case. And one of the great privileges, you already know this from your clinics and your field placements and other things, that one of the great privilege of being a lawyer is to be able to give a helping hand to people like Jonathan Irons, to Tony Amadeo, to lift people up in ways large and small. People win their cases when they have lawyers, and sometimes people can't even get into court without lawyers. Even if you have a world-class basketball star on your side, you still need that lawyer. That lawyer that learned what you learned in your your criminal procedure class, that case of Brady versus Maryland says you can't suppress exculpatory evidence. That's what a lawyer stood in front of a judge in Missouri and got a man out of prison who shouldn't have been there. But you know, too, from the work that you've done in the clinics and elsewhere, that many people with desperate needs have no lawyer, have no access to a lawyer. People facing evictions from their homes, people facing trials, people in prison unlawfully, like the people that I've talked about, parents threatened with the loss of their children, people thrown into debtors' prisons because they can't pay their fines, and people subject to unconscionable conditions in jails and prisons in this country. The list is a long, long list. And the one challenge that the legal profession faces, one great challenge, the profession that you'll join, is whether those people will have their day in court. Will a lawyer from a legal services program, from a public defender office, from an immigrant rights program, or will an individual lawyer, will one of you stepping forward to offer services pro bono to see that these folks for whom the legal system is like being dropped in a foreign land with a foreign language and foreign customs, that somebody will provide the guiding light, the guiding hand of counsel through their case? Of course, there's much that can be said in praise of our legal system, but I'm not going to spend any time doing that. This is no time for complacency. This is no time to pat ourselves on the back. This is a time when we've got to say, who's hurting out there? Who's hurting and needs us? Who's crying and needs help? What children? What parents losing their children? What people out on the streets? What mentally ill people? What intellectually limited people who are desperate? Lawyers have a monopoly on providing people with the access to the legal system. And of course, it provides the opportunity to ration legal services, to set a very high price for them, and to sell them only to the people that can afford to pay. But of course, the purpose of our legal system is to serve the public interest by providing a civilized way to resolve disputes. The Supreme Court has said in several cases there can be no equal justice when the kind of justice a person gets depends upon the amount of money they have. Of course, that's aspirational. We all know good and well that the kind of justice that a person gets depends very much upon the amount of money they have. Unfortunately, a common strategy in many cases today is to keep people from even having lawyers, or to take advantage if they have very bad lawyers. A man named Glenn Ford was convicted and spent 30 years on death row in Louisiana, and then he was exonerated. Turned out he was completely innocent. The prosecutor who prosecuted his case wrote a letter to the local paper in which he apologized for taking advantage of the fact that Ford was represented by two lawyers who had, in a death penalty case, who had never tried a case before. An oil and gas lawyer and a slip and fall lawyer, whatever that is. I hope that you will decide today or sometime soon not to take advantage of people because they don't have lawyers, and not to take advantage of people because they have incompetent lawyers. The responsibility of the legal profession is not to let the pursuit of wealth obliterate the pursuit of justice. All of you, regardless of how you will spend your life in the law, at a law firm, at a business, in a prosecutor's office, and other government service, all the many, many ways in which lawyers contribute to society, are responsible for ensuring access to the legal system so it works for everybody. You've got to see that there's sufficient funding for public defender programs, for legal services, for all the other kind of public interest programs out there. And you've got to step forward and help people out who won't have it otherwise. I hope at your time at the bar, the next 50 years you have it as a lawyer, that you'll make that above the Supreme Court building equal justice under law. Get us closer to the reality of equal justice under law. As we look at the challenges of the legal profession during the time that you're in it, we also have to recognize that the kind of justice a person has depends upon race. Jonathan Irons and Glenn Ford were both black men. They were both tried by all-white juries. Today, we continue to see all-white juries in communities that have substantial black or Hispanic populations. We see racial prejudice in the actions of some law enforcement officers, in some charging decisions by prosecutors, in some bail and sentencing decisions by judges. If you have some free time, and you might have some after you take the bar and before you start to work, I encourage you to go to Montgomery, Alabama, and visit the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. It's a memorial to 4,400 men, women, and children, most of them African American, who were lynched between 1877 and 1950. And also the Legacy Museum, which traces the history of slavery to convict leasing to Jim Crow, when the law required discrimination, to mass incarceration, what we have today. They're long overdue. We now have in the United States, we have in Montgomery what you have in Germany and what you have in Germany with regard to the memorials and museums regarding the Holocaust, and in South Africa regarding apartheid. The memorial and museum have had quite an impact on people who've been there. After the opening, a couple of years ago, the Montgomery Advertiser newspaper ran a front-page apology for its coverage of lynchings, saying it took responsibility for a false narrative regarding the treatment of African Americans during those dark times. Jeffrey Rosen, the district attorney in Santa Clara, California, announced after visiting that he would not seek the death penalty anymore as district attorney. And just last month, he announced that he was going to try to vacate the death penalties of the 14 people from Santa Clara that are under death sentence in California. This summer on Juneteenth, that's June the 19th, Brian Stevenson and his colleagues there will dedicate a sculpture park that takes an unflinching look at slavery. Every judge, every legislator, every lawyer, really everyone, should visit the memorial, the museum, the sculpture park, because they show how law has been misused in our history. We must confront the truth. We must acknowledge its impact on the present, and we must seek reconciliation and justice as we strive towards a more perfect union. I also want to quote Langston Hughes, a great poet of the Harlem Renaissance, who sort of summed up the challenge we face today. He said, "There's a dream about the land with its back against the wall. By muddled names and strange, sometimes the dream is called. There are those who claim this dream for theirs alone, a sin for which we know they surely must atone. Because unless shared in common, like the sunlight and the air, the dream will die for lack of substance anywhere. The dream knows no frontier or tongue, the dream no class or race. This dream cannot be kept secure in any one locked place. This dream today in battle with its back against the wall, to save the dream for one, it must be saved for all." Thank you, good luck, and Godspeed.